All right, so this is the period three overview. And before we get really started on this, I want to talk about the exam this year. So now remember, the exam is only going to be a DBQ. And I know a lot of you in APUSH. I don't know what Durham has done, but I've seen Peter's video. And obviously, I know his video making skills are a heck of a lot better than mine. Mine are non existent, basically. But there's a 10-point rubric, and most teachers think that you need to get 6 points to to pass. That's with the three. I know most of you want higher than that. I want you to get higher than that. There's 1 point for contextualization, and there's 2 points for outside evidence. And those 3 points are why we're still doing these period three overviews. By doing the overviews, you are learning what's going on in the big picture, which helps you do contextualization. And also, I'm giving you all these little facts, like we just did your essays just a few minutes ago online on, Bishop Bossuet and all that. He's very likely, him and Hobbes and Locke, you're very likely to get documents from them. And what you will have now is outside evidence that you can use. So anyway, even though it seems like, because the final exam, the AP exam is going to be a DBQ, it may seem like we shouldn't be doing these reviews. Yes, we should. 3 of your 6 points are dependent on these reviews. The other parts, I think, like the thesis, I think most of you really know how to do one. Anyway, let's go ahead and get period three overview started here. All right, so now, and remember, I'm giving you hints at what your SAQs are going to be. Here's the big timeline and the main topics here. So this is the time period of the isms. And this thing starts out with the Congress of Vienna. And remember, the Congress of Vienna, I always tell kids, that is synonymous with the Concert of Europe. And these are the winning powers of the Napoleonic Wars. And basically, they're very conservative. This is also known as the Age of Metternich. And Metternich just wants peace. I always tell kids, think of that word, Concert of Europe. Concerts to me are supposed to be very, very peaceful. And as I told you in class, my daughter was in band, and she has her degree in, basically French horn, music education. And I'd always go to watch her concerts, and they were so peaceful I'd fall asleep. And my wife would say, "What'd you think about her solo?" And I'm like, "What solo? I was asleep the whole time." But anyway, so think of Congress of Vienna, and the Concert of Europe as a time of peace. That was the purpose. And Metternich put this together. And his thing is, as you can see here, conservatism. And he's basically against liberalism, which is what came out of the Enlightenment, or what led to the Enlightenment. And he's against nationalism, which obviously is what's going to lead to World War I and World War II. Anyway, the Age of Reason was, the age of the Enlightenment. That was before. That's what led to the French Revolution. And Romanticism comes along and says, "You guys, this is a reaction to that." We've got socialism, early utopian socialism, and Marxism, and this all ends. The Age of Metternich ends with the 1848 revolutions. And remember, Metternich flees Austria in a disguise. I always compare that to Jefferson Davis fleeing after the Confederate States lost the Civil War. And the Yankees would later on say that the men that caught him, that he was dressed as a woman. I honestly don't know if that story is true or not. But anyway, let's go on here to the second time period. This is the time period of the Crimean War. I'm going to go over that in detail, but I'll give you a little bit now. The Crimean War was where the Russians went up against the British and the French and the Ottomans. And the Ottomans are also already known as the sick man of Europe. And what they were doing was they were keeping the Russians from being any more powerful. So the three of them fought against the Russians in the Crimean War. There's a lot of modern weapons used there. It was kind of like trench warfare there at the end. And Russia's defeat in that led to the reforms in Russia. There's the Italian-German unification. Remember, Italian unification is Count Cavour, Garibaldi. What was the king's name? Shoot, let me think here. Victor Emmanuel, Piedmont, Sardinia. German unification, of course, that's Bismarck. Oh, and here we see it, the Russian reforms. We're going to be talking about specifically France, Britain, and Austria. Moving on. I don't ever use this phrase, la belle époque, or however you say it in French. But this is the time period, right? That's the beginning of the American Civil War in 1861. but this is the second industrial revolution. It's a growth of mass political parties. We would have done a unit on mass political parties if we had been able to get to the very next chapter, because the time of mass political parties is obviously Mussolini and Hitler. It's the first wave of feminism, the evolution of modern thought, and then there's the new imperialism. That's the scramble for Africa. There's what were their reasons. A lot of this was mercantilism. They wanted, although I think by this point mercantilism by 1870 is probably kind of faded and been replaced by capitalism and the ideas of Adam Smith. But they still wanted colonies and they wanted to exploit them. There was a lot of racism involved, white man's burden, and some of their tools were quinine, smokeless powder, telegraphs, and we'll get to all that. And it's related to industrialism. They wanted raw materials and they wanted markets for their materials. And basically, Asian Africa were pretty well dominated. Remember, South America is already gone. I mean, it's totally under European influence by now. And we'll talk about the effects of the new imperialism. And of course, people like Lenin are going to, and I never really got much of a chance to talk about Lenin because, I did talk about him because we did do World War One. So I guess but I would have come back and spent more time on him. It's a shame that you're going to finish this course without knowing about Stalin and World War II and all that. Anyway, and there's the effects of the new imperialism. What I was going to say is this is what Lenin would say was one of the causes of World War One. Okay, this imperialism. All right, moving on. All right, the Congress of Vienna. The key thing, remember, about Congress of Vienna, it is conservative. Remember where it met? It met in Metternich's villa. And I always think of a villa as like a summer house for rich people. And I'm sure some of you know your families have summer houses, beach houses. I have all these water polo players and swimmers who I find out years after they graduated that they had a beach house. And I always make a joke about it. And you didn't invite your coach over. And it's like the kid one day told me his dad had a 45-foot yacht. But I guess the idea of them seeing me in a Speedo was just too much for them. Anyway, this is the post-Napoleonic Wars. They wanted to reestablish legitimacy and the balance of power. There's that key phrase here, balance of power. Because if you remember, France had its borders. And then, the French Revolution begins in 1789. By 1792, France is bigger. So when they had the Congress of Vienna, France lost the Napoleonic Wars. You think they would have kept them back on their earlier borders, but they let them keep their 1792 borders. They strengthened Prussia, and they called Prussia the Sentinel on the Rhine, because what they wanted to do was Prussia to be there to make sure that France didn't get out of line again. And there's the four winning powers. I call it the three EAs plus England that is there. And that is Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and the UK or England or Britain, whatever term you want to use for it. That is the Congress of Vienna. But if you remember, there was a fifth person there, a fifth negotiator at Metternich's villa, and it was a guy from the XYZ affair, Talleyrand. And he's the French guy, and we call that the wily fifth. Remember, wily's supposed to mean smart. And I always tell kids during the lecture, you wouldn't have thought that that France would have even been allowed to participate in the Congress of Vienna. But of course they were, because this was balance of power. They wanted to kind of make France happy. And that's kind of what we're going to do somewhat after World War II. Anyway, remember, the Congress of Vienna is often compared to the Treaty of Versailles because they're about 100 years apart and they both start with a V. Vienna, Versailles. I tend to get them mixed up in class. Congress of Vienna is considered fairly successful, and it's probably more of a model for what the Allies did after World War II, which of course we never got to talk about. The Treaty of Versailles is at the end of World War I, and it is considered a failure. But anyway, let's go on with what it did. It preserved traditions, institutions, aristocracy. Here's how conservative it is. It actually goes and remember, Louis XVI had been executed. His son died of abandonment somewhere, the Dauphin. They brought back Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, and made him king of France. And they wanted to suppress liberal reform and popular government and nationalism. They don't want everyone having the right to vote. So this is a very conservative order. And remember, that's what Metternich called himself. I am a rock of order. All right, moving on. Here's the isms. We're going to go as far as we can. I'm trying to keep my videos at 15 minutes in length. Conservatism, preserve the traditional order, supported by the monarchs. I don't know why Nicholas the First is considered a gendarme. The gendarme is that's I don't know what language it is. I think it might be actually be French, but the gendarme they're cops, and so I guess it's like he's the policeman of Europe. I have not heard that before, but I know what the term means. There's the concert of Europe, the Congress system, collective security. Okay, this is also that's conservatism epitomized by Metternich. Then you have nationalism, where you have national boundaries according to ethnicity and nationality, popular sovereignty and self-determination. But the problems they have is with these minority groups there in these heterogeneous empires. And remember the three big multinational empires are Austria, soon to be called Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. All of them are basically going to collapse because of World War One, which we did get to. And by the way, for contextualization, I was talking about those DBQs. You can also talk about what happens afterwards. Most of us teach our kids to talk about, hey, what was going on before this essay topic begins, but you can also talk about what happened before, what happened during, what happened after. Anyway, so you can talk about that. And then there's liberalism, moderate political reform and freer economic markets. This is where you want to have your governments regulated by constitutions. There's legal equality, toleration, freedom, education, and there's wealth. There's middle class, not just the upper and the lower, but there's middle class. And there's classical liberal economies. That means Adam Smith. So this is not mercantilism or mercantilism, however you say it. This is Adam Smith and capitalism. All right, so some of the 19th century revolts. 1821 to 1830, there were many failed liberal and national revolts against the status quo. And there's some successes. Okay, so here we go. There was the Greek independence, which happened, I don't know if it was 1821, but it happened in the 1820s. The Greeks revolted for their independence against the Ottomans. And if you remember, the British and the French and the Russians joined in and helped the Greeks. In Metternich, you figure Austria next door would have wanted the Greeks to be independent because the Greeks are, quote, Christians. You would figure they would have wanted them to have won against the Ottoman Muslims, but Metternich was so much of a conservative, he didn't want any change at all. So Metternich was actually against fighting the Austrians helping out the Greeks, but eventually Austria did because their people wanted to so much. And this was a big deal. The Greek, I think you did the DBQ on it, at least one of my classes did. The Greek War of Independence, and this is the time of Romanticism because people they thought that the Greeks were the birthplace of civilization. There's also the Revolution of 1830 in France. Remember, you had the first French Revolution, then you have the Revolution of 1830, and that is where, they give them basically a fairly liberal government. 1848 is that is the year that Marx published his book, The Communist Manifesto. And this is the end of the age of Metternich. There's at least three big revolutions. Another French one. There is one in Prussia, and there is one in Austria. And there was something that happened down in Italy. Some people teach three revolutions of 1848. Some teach four. The big thing you need to understand is there's these revolts and there's people wanting rights. All of them are going to fail. You see here where it says that they generally failed. And the conservatives regain power. But the thing about it is the ruling powers can see that these people want rights and they're going to get them. And Bismarck's going to come along later on. If you remember, Bismarck gave his people free health care. And it's not that he believed in free health care, but he's like, hey, these people want rights. They're going to go to the socialists to give them to them. So why shouldn't the conservatives give them to them? And it was actually a pretty smart move. Britain, and I'm going to move this thing up here, is the only country to make moderate reform changes without a rebellion. And, they had all their trouble over the Corn Laws. and the